least 5 minutes.
Sure. Sounds good. Yeah, I wasn't quite sure where to gauge today's introduction. If folks are really new to EPO, then we can start in a different place. Or
I think, well, I mean, so this whole thing is kind of coming out of it's an extension of, I guess, our book club we were doing on sex, ecology, spirituality, we did that for like 8 weeks, and then people wanted to kind of keep going with something, and so then Brandon and I chatted a little bit, and then we threw around some ideas on Facebook and stuff, and so I think the context for this is more of a deeper dive, in the sense that it's not just an introduction, but more like people presumably, if they haven't read it, maybe cover to cover, at least to sort of familiarize themselves a little bit more with it. So yeah, I also feel like, because you're sort of everyone's resident Gebserian, that you're probably often in the position of sort of giving a more introductory kind of pitch, a Gebser pitch. But I'd like to go maybe a little more into the weeds, if possible.
Yeah, that sounds very fun. So I'm hoping we get to do that.
Cool. That's my take. What do you think, Norgard?
Yeah, I think that with Wilbur, he is the one who brought a lot of these things together, whereas they kind of previously lived in their own little silo, but his integration wasn't necessarily the only integration. And one of the main sources is Gebser, and then I guess that there's other sources out there, such as Aurobindo. I think that Zach Stein might be kind of an Aurobindo expert, and so it's good to hear those the experts within each of these feeders into Wilbur. That's not necessarily, again, to say that Wilbur's version is the authoritative one. It's more, though, that that's what kind of got the ball rolling about 25, 30 years ago, in terms of getting people to think about how all of these threads could come together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We could just start rolling with this as part of the ongoing conversation. But yeah, I think I've actually been revisiting Up from Eden and the Ottman Project recently, in part of my kind of review of literature for my next book that I've been working on right now, Fragments of an Integral Future. And I didn't intend for the opening of this new book to be a kind of retelling of our history or the origins of consciousness, but it ended up being that. So at any rate, I've had to kind of go back and review all of the literature, including Wilbur, et cetera, and how the framing and the narratives are actually showing up in Wilbur's work. So that's all fresh for me too. I haven't revisited SES recently, but that's part of my annotated bibliography for sure.
Currently listening to Jeremy.
Well, maybe this one's too loaded to be our initial question, or my initial question anyway. But I would love to hear you talk a little bit about some of those differentiations. So I'm also actually at Bruce Alderman's suggestion, also going on the Ottman Project and Up from Eden route. And it's really interesting to see how much continuity, actually. I was surprised to see how much continuity there is even there from 78. And so I guess I'd be curious how you would maybe frame, how you would differentiate Wilbur's integral perspective versus Gebser's. Specifically, I'd love to hear about the aperspectival kind of structure that Gebser's talking about, and how that might relate to the kind of integral stage that Wilbur's talking about. Because for me, I see, like, I feel like they track fairly well when you started talking about the history of like the different structures, magical, mythical, etc. But then when you actually get into articulating what is that new conscious structure, that's when I feel like there's the most kind of differentiation. So maybe just starting there and then maybe going in a little bit deeper to that question. If you wanted to address some of that, I'd be curious.
Yeah, that's a good starting place. So as you're saying, like in Up from Eden, particularly, there's a lot of material that Wilber draws from Gebser, just quoting the ever-present origin and the structures of consciousness to illustrate Wilber's points about the sort of unfolding history of consciousness, right? But yeah, when we get to integral, what's interesting is, first of all, Gebser's approach is even in his foundation is quite a bit different in that he's not really desiring to describe the archaic, magic, mythic, et cetera, these categories as stages, but rather as structures. And there's a subtlety there that I think is too often very quickly dismissed, in the sense that he doesn't necessarily want to portray this as sort of a linear ascent, right? Or a climb up, literally, not a climb up from Eden necessarily. But then we kind of get into something interesting where he's very clear about that. He's talking about a history of consciousness, an awakening of consciousness. So there seems to be some tensions there where he's attempting to articulate emergence, unfoldment, awakening, describing this history, but he wants to do it in a much less linear way. So that's sort of his template that Gebser's working with, right?
I wanted to throw actually some quotes by you because that was another related question I have, but just to your point, I guess I can pretty much quote page number because this is sort of the authoritative edition. But on 37, he says, "We must exclude from our discussion as far as possible such misleading notions as quote unquote development and quote unquote progress." And he makes that point a couple of times, and that's why he uses the word mutation. Though also to your point, this tension on page 41, he then says, "With the unfolding of each new consciousness mutation, consciousness increases in intensity." So there's sort of like this strange, is that not development? Is that not progress? And so why not? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I felt like that was another one of those crucial tensions that was coming up for me when I was delving into this.
Yeah, and in what do you call it? Towards the end of part one, Gebser kind of goes into this in a particular chapter where he's beginning to talk about mass and measurement and gains and losses, where he's really trying to unpack what he means by that. And essentially, he's describing a process where each structure that unfolds in history reveals some kind of new dimensionality, let's say like the mental structure and the emergence of the ego or self-reflection, right? The self-reflexive ego. Great, that's awesome. Spatial thinking, that emerges. But what also is lost is a sense of that magical interweaving. So there's a kind of magical intelligence, if we could call it intelligence, or knowing, or as I use in my writing, a magical ontology that's almost complementary to this emerging mythic or the emerging mental. And so when you look at the whole history, the whole shape of the history of consciousness is this kind of trading off of new complexities and new capabilities in exchange for other ways of being that are kind of closed off or go back into latency or have become in a pathologized way dissociated from the emergent structure, right? So they're kind of like breaking off into new forms of differentiation, but not necessarily neatly integrating, even though they kind of depend in kind of a historical chronological sense, right? Like you grow older, right? There's a sense of time going in a particular direction. And yet for Gebser, it gets much more complicated when we talk about entire human societies and the history of those societies. It becomes much more, and this is what I'm bringing in my contemporary book, a way to describe that process rather than Gebser's gains and losses, which it's pretty straightforward in and of itself, but I'm describing it as complementary complexities, right? That the magical and mythical structures, you say, indigenous cultures, indigenous communities, the complexities of Paleolithic societies stand alongside some of the advancements, quote unquote, and complexities of the, let's say, being a modern, right, and the scientific method, and et cetera, and some of the achievements of civilization, right, rather than seeing them as sort of successive in any kind of unilateral way. They're complementary. And I think this is very clear in Gebser's writing as well, right? There's emergence, but it's really messy. And there's a kind of dynamical process of interrelationship where the magic and the mythic all kind of interplay and mingle and co-inform one another in both healthy and unhealthy ways as we kind of go throughout linear historical time. But what's interesting with the integral consciousness is kind of coming back around to that big question, right? For Gebser, he's saying the integral is a sort of capacity to render transparent that whole history, to say like the genius of the magic and the mythic in its own right, the genius of the mental in its own right are both rendered transparent. And the human being, as a kind of this process of intensification, is able to bring all of them out to play with each other, right, as needed in the present. And so that kind of plasticity and capacity for fluidity between the structures by being by having them so transparent and so present to us is what he's talking about with integrality. Another big distinction might be, particularly with the question of what exactly is the integral structure and when did it show up, is Gebser's emphasis on time and integral consciousness, which is a very big deal for Gebser. In the latter half of Ever Present Origin, he goes into a kind of history of history, as it were, history of the theme of time as it begins to kind of show up more and more throughout modernity and throughout the Industrial Revolution and into the 20th century crises, et cetera. So for Gebser, time isn't just mental directive time or chronological time or historical time, right? Starting from here, going forward, growing up and then becoming older, things are new and then things fall apart. That kind of sense of time is certainly real for Gebser, but he's saying there's almost a plurality of times according to each of the structures, corresponding to each of them. So for the magical, there's more of this sense of timelessness or interchangeability of time, of past and present and future. The mythical, it's this rhythmicity or polarity of time. So we can kind of think of the seasons or astronomical calendars, right? And I've given this intro before, but like there's a plurality or a polyvalent sense of time for Gebser, and directive mental time is just one. Now with the integral, again, it's that sense of transparency, having that magical timelessness, that mythical temporicity and polarity or complementarity available to us along with history, right? And another big distinction for Gebser is with the integral structure, there's a move away from spatializing not only time, but the world, right? The kind of perspectival subject-object relationship that many philosophers have talked about with Cartesianism, and this capacity to spatialize and segment and distinguish, well, as a particularly for us, it's a gift, right? It allows science to come into being, et cetera. For Gebser, he's saying, well, we're kind of moving into, again, time is being introduced and we're moving into a much more processual relationship with things, right? We don't see things as objects, but things as in relation with other things, kind of co-informing one another. And we see that kind of more explicitly in, let's say, like Whitehead's work, right? Or Bergson's work. And I think Gebser to some degree was it was in the atmosphere at his time, particularly just thinking about the major breakthroughs in physics and the new philosophies of the early to mid 20th century. So for Gebser, time is the fundamental theme of the integral age, and the crisis point for the collapse of the mental structure of consciousness for Gebser is this tension between spatializing the world and sort of fixing it categorically, and this new kind of temporal aliveness, right? Where things and their intensities are really kind of springing up. And there's this interesting, it's almost like a dialectic, although I know Gebser wasn't comfortable with that either. But it almost is a kind of push-pull thing where the advancements and the unleashing of technological innovations and capital, for instance, is this kind of intensification of time. So the mental structure is sort of unleashing time, but then it's not able to master it. And so this is sort of like a crescendo effect, right? Where things are reaching a fever pitch. And the theme of time continues to break into our culture. And this is very similar to like McLuhan talking about the electronic age and how space doesn't matter anymore. And the telegraph has collapsed, 2 points of space. And the newer generations aren't thinking spatially anymore or thinking causally with print, but they're thinking holistically. or almost hieroglyphically, right, as this constellation of relationships. Gebser's trying to articulate a very similar language for the spirit of this integral age, right? The form of being, the ontology of the integral age is this sort of breaking out from spatialization and segmentation into this, again, constellation of relationships, process, time, wholeness, etc. So anyway, that's a lot. But
well, I have a question about that. So like, just a follow-up, I guess. So, Wilbur's got sort of his climber, rung and view approach, right? So you climb up the ladder, and the rung, as you do so, gets transcended but included, but the view gets negated, because your view is going to be different from each rung. So you basically can't have a magical view while you're also simultaneously having a mythical view, et cetera. Like in Wilbur's sort of framing of this, those are mutually exclusive. It seems like Gebser is sort of saying the opposite, that actually the integral is sort of the simultaneity, that all of these are sort of happening contemporaneously. I mean, is that fair to say? Is that a meaningful distinction between how they articulate this sort of integral perspective?
I think so. I mean, if Wilbur means even for the integral stage, there's still this sort of, okay, here I'm seeing from where I'm at, then yeah, I think that is a distinction, because Gebser's description for aperspectivity or integral aperspectivity, is his description for it, is seeing from all sides. And he illustrates this in a lot of his work, right, with Picasso's painting and some of the experimentations in modernist art, which by no means he was saying was like the definitive expression of integrality, but he was saying like a lot of these artists were playing around with this attempt to see past, present, future movement from all different directions, right? So the seeing from all sides is really characteristic of this integrality or aperspectivity. And even the word aperspectival, Gebser was very specific about in that he was using alpha privativum for the A, and so he's saying this is a freedom for any particular structure of consciousness, but it's also a freedom from any one particular structure. So there is this kind of emancipatory movement with the integral that nevertheless lets us totally concretize any one of them. One of the things that I really like, this is from McLuhan again, but the comparisons are so interesting. And I'm hoping to write more about this in the maybe next year. But for McLuhan, he uses as a metaphor for electronic culture and like the human being in the electronic age, a Joycean analogy of a colloidoscope or a kaleidoscope of consciousness, so that all of the different communication mediums across history are suddenly available for this Joycean protagonist. And again, like a kaleidoscope of different structures that are all shifting in a sort of mercurial sense, but not in a kind of maybe one of the distinctions to make here is again, it's consciously, right? There's an intensive lucidity in our capacity to bring this forth. So yeah, I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but yeah, seeing from all sides, transparency is one of the themes for Gebser in the integral structure. And again, this like acknowledging that all of the structures are always co-present and kind of co-informing us in any given particular moment, even right now, like not just 10,000 years ago, but the magic and the mythic are also here and co-informing how we think and how we do the mental.
Thanks, that's helpful. Yeah, I have many more questions, but I'll yield the mic.
Yeah,
I don't know who wants to take it next. Yeah, go for it.
Thomas, you want to jump in, and then Brandon?
Actually, it was Brendan first, so
okay.
I'll let him go.
If you want to do that.
Well, all right. Yeah. What I was thinking, when I guess this maybe a disagreement between Wilbur and Gebser as to whether you can have the perspective of the mythical and magical simultaneously. And this reminds me of some of the work done recently where you have Henry Andrews doing this analysis based on Claire Graves' original work of the spiral dynamics, and that's one of the inspirations for spiral dynamics. I don't know if this is getting a little coarse grained here, so I apologize if it is, but that where he's recognizing that you have different aspects of the consciousness that are can be expressed, and I think that is something. This is something also I'm looking at. I've been looking at recently with how Greg Enriquez's UTOC system can be extended to provide a psychological basis for a lot of the social science theories that are out there, including spiral dynamics. And what I think what we have is where consciousness has this expansion quality, but then when you have interaction with other people, with objects, with hyper objects, you are oftentimes simultaneously communicating different things, based on the same, you could say it's a stack, it's a communications protocol stack. So you have essentially those different perspectives. And in fact, I would think that, with the different consciousness unfolding, or the mutations of consciousness, you do still have those inner perspectives of those earlier perspectives. I think that sometimes happens within our symphony of selves. So I think that does happen, I think that we can have simultaneously those perspectives because there is more than one self inside of ourselves, and these can speak simultaneously and interact simultaneously in our complex world.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. There's Gebser even uses the word polyvalent to describe the structures. And what you end up getting if you take that as your primary model of human consciousness is you get an entire history of consciousness where there's a kind of innate integrality in the human being. It may not be unfolded, but it's always kind of there to varying degrees of latency or actualization. And then you get a much more plastic view of, well, okay, Paleolithic societies weren't just magical because we have evidence of their usage of cyclical time and astronomical calendars on cave paintings, and they were building monolithic sites, and we have evidence of authoritarian structures and almost like proto-cities during particular seasonal aggregations. So, okay, there's a lot of complexity in all that. They must have had some aspects of the mental at play here, is almost like an organelle of a cell. And then later on, you get this sense in which, well, okay, the mental really came into itself as civilization really began its momentum, and we kind of got locked into this thing called the state, right? And print systems, et cetera. So you get a sense of like a very dynamic fluidity of all of these interrelated structures and how they must all play some part in any moment of our particular history. And it ends up being much more descriptive, I think, of the actual historical data out there, archaeological data. And then for the single human being, right, there is a sense in which it's a much more complex while acknowledging the unfolding process happening as well, right? Because we could say that, if we started to lean towards the mental and spatialization in the secular age, et cetera, that was one way the mental played out, right? That is one of many ways it's played out. And maybe there's a general shape of this unfolding of consciousness we can make some big generalist claims about, and I think we can. I'm a generalist in that sense, like I'm an integral thinker in that sense as well, but it's just so much more fluid and dynamic, and I think it's a much healthier view of our own history, right? So yes to that, and I would say the Gebser's word would be polyvalence of the structures. Yeah, Thomas, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, hey, and thanks for inviting me. Great to see some familiar faces. Brennan, to just quickly add to that, I had a hard time talking about structure stages to completely novices to developmental models, and I was trying to present each emergent one as like a quality, and that seemed to both address how it emerged as as an innovative feature to consciousness historically, but both in the present moment, you have access to your redness. And yeah, that seems to work with my own upper left quadrant self-inquiry as well. Yeah, Jeremy, my question is regarding movies which twist time, like Arrival, Tenet, Interstellar. Yeah, mostly these. What's your input from a Gebserian point of view?
Oh, that's a whole topic. We can have fun with that. Yeah, no,
Floor is yours.
Ted Chiang and The Story of Your Life, and then Arrival by Denis Villeneuve. Arrival particularly is one of my favorite films because I think it's a very thoughtful exploration and a very Gebserian exploration of what it might mean to have, because so far we've been kind of talking about the fluidity of the structures and how they're all kind of co-present, but part of Gebser's more bold claim is that the future shapes the present too, that there is a kind of agentic creative force that the future has on the present, and the past also does. So in the same way he sees this sort of dynamic interrelationship of the structures, he's also seeing this as almost like the shape of time itself, right? That time is this dynamic thing, which means the future shapes us as well as the past and vice versa. So it's a really one of the terms that he drops is poetically, I love it, but it's very enigmatic and difficult to really wrap our heads around is time freedom. And he says basically, what the integral structure is initiating in humanity is not only a more complex sense of time that's polyvalent, right? Timelessness, temporicity, directive, mental, chronological time, but then this other sort of multi-dimensional present, right? In which the future actually has some kind of incipient a creative force on us, and vice versa, as I've been saying. So then it becomes kind of interesting. And the question becomes like, well, maybe the future is shaping us. Maybe there are practices of imagination and vision, et cetera, that might empower that relationship a bit more, a bit more creatively and lucidly to bring the future right in, or to actualize particular futures. So films like Arrival, just to kind of go back to that, are really playing with this idea that actually something can happen. And it plays in a very Gebserian sense too, because if you read Ever Present Origin, you'll see Gebser writes all about language. Everything is etymological in his consideration. He was a poet first before he really dived into scholarship. So he's always interested in what a word is particularly imparting and the history of that word. So he kind of traces very often this sort of etymology, a history of consciousness through etymology, so that earlier words have this sort of archaic rootedness and they can kind of mean multiple things. And then they kind of mean this complement. They usually have like ambiguous meanings, right? Like even with the Latin word tot, T-O-T, means all, but it also means death. So totality takes on this sort of ambiguous sense of life and death, right? Of everything and nothing. And that style of thinking was meant to illustrate, anyway, in his book, how language and the consciousness structures go hand in hand with each other. So we have something like Arrival, where, the protagonists are exploring this alien language, and the language itself is written and shaped in such a way that it's like, yeah, everything is all happening at once. It's like they're seeing from all sides, past, present, and future, and they construct their words that way. And that act of working with language for the protagonist starts to create a mutation of consciousness in the protagonist, where she starts to maybe see from the future. I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but sure, I think the theme of time as a trope and motif in our culture right now is very, very prevalent. And we can give many, many more examples, but you mentioned some of the most artistic ones, one being Arrival. So I think Gebser would really much enjoy that film, or would have enjoyed that film. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that in. And we can kind of revisit it maybe if we keep weaving this theme in today. Yeah. Brendan, you want to jump back in?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the etymology thing, because I'd love to pick your brain about that a little bit. That was one of the elements of Gebser that was the hardest for me, because Gebser is not doing straight up etymology at all, right? I mean, like the example you just used, tot, like in the Latin totus, but tot in German meaning death, right? Those are not etymologically related, but he is almost sort of, he's working with that as a poet, you know, that there's a resonance there. But like any kind of philologist would say, no, that's folk etymology. That's, you know, and I was kind of curious how serious he is employing his etymology practices throughout his work, because, you know, are they just sort of like rhetorical flourishes, like look at this, or is he trying to simultaneously inhabit sort of a magical mode of similarity and bring that forth, even though his mental mode might be aware that that's not etymologically accurate? Like, I'd love to hear a little bit more about his use of etymology to make his point that, like, you know, a classical philologist, you know, wouldn't sort of allow.
Sure. And I think Gebser goes out of his way to make some caveats and disclaimers before he does that. And I don't remember if he says it before that one, but there are other occasions where he will say, these aren't connected, but in this poetic sense that we're working with here, the connections are very evident, right? So I think he is working with another layer of meaning. I wouldn't say it's flourish. I would say it's a poetic reading of something that he's arguing is equally important as, let's say, like, you know, the philologist might be arguing from. But I wouldn't say that that's all of what his etymological readings are. I mean, there's very careful attention to sort of like the Indo-European root words and what they actually mean. And I don't think those are contested by a lot of philologists as far as what I've been able to read up. So I would say he uses both, and he uses them interchangeably. And he's very careful, frustratingly careful about these disclaimers. You might, for folks who are reading Gebser for the first time, there are so many disclaimers and caveats and just him explaining himself and what he's about to do, right? Or how it won't be the entire picture, or how essentially this is only for convenience sake we can use these categories, and you might be flustered by that a little bit, but it's part of his meticulous approach, I think, to this, where he's being meticulous, but then he's also allowing for this poetic capacity to make those kinds of connections, to connect the dots in a way that a specialized discipline may not want to make the jump to. So if that makes sense. Yeah. Brandon, if you want to jump in too.
Well, you know, on the one hand, you have, I mean, there's more than one approach to etymology, and I don't think there's any perfect way to do it. And on the one hand, you have, for example, Heidegger talking about sedimentation, where he, you know, sometimes over the course of centuries, these words can change meanings quite dramatically. But he thinks that there is still a sedimentation of an original meaning. And this is the case sometimes, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes these words completely change their meaning. And then with regard to these false friends, you know, where you have similar sounding words in different languages that come together, I think that some of the words that we have, some of the words and their meanings are partially the result of these language collisions. And you have words in different languages, and the word that ended up coming out in this collision is a mixture of the two meanings, even though it wasn't supposed to be that way. I'm not sure if there's, you know, an example that's really coming to mind right now, but if I looked for it, I could come up with an example of this, you know, where you essentially have like where you guys were talking about this tot, meaning, you know, on the one hand in Latin all, and then the other in German death. Well, if I looked hard enough, I could think of a word. If I could find a word in English that is the result where our modern meaning was essentially come from two different threads, two different prior languages, and that it somehow got mutated. And actually, perhaps one example is the word gas. Now, that's actually it's a collision between the word ghost or geest in Dutch and chaos in Greek.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's a there's definitely a sense of what was I going to say? This part of Gebser's project, in terms of really looking at root words and seeing the structures in the history of language itself, is definitely aligned with Owen Barfield's work with like poetic diction and saving the appearances. And Barfield obviously is focused more on the Anglo world, but for Gebser, it's more he's looking across different languages, obviously German, etc. But yeah, sometimes though it is a kind of play. In the same manner, maybe that these languages did collide. Gebser is playing with different constellations of meaning across different languages, and sometimes is to illustrate a point, and other times it is to kind of point out, what the etymologists are actually saying. So there's a fluidity there. I wanted to just jump in with one quote that might be nice here, and then we can keep going around. But just to give you kind of a summation of what he means by this. And this is him kind of describing his interest in this, right? Okay, so he says, this temporal aspect resides in the primordial meaning of the word root, which even today gives the word in latent and potential form its distinctive stamp. It is the original meaning that is still luminous throughout the unfolding changes of meaning taken on or attributed over the years. Every word, after all, is not only a concept or fixed equivalent in writing, it is also an image and thus mythical, a sound and thus magic, a root and thus archaic, and thus by virtue of this root meaning, still present from origin. So in some ways, I mean, again, it's a very poetic statement, but he's saying like just the very usage of language itself is all of the structures are present there. It's a concept. It's so, I mean, you could see it in this if you're not familiar. When he's saying, okay, it's a concept, he's saying, okay, well, it's a mental expression. It's an image. So mythical, the symbolic language of myth is very much in the image. It's a sound. The magical is very much associated for Gebser with acoustics, the auditory senses, right? So he's saying all the structures are there. And then he says archaic, right? Root. So in a similar way, there's a similar, again, a sort of poetic here, but the way that Paul Klee is discussed and later on in the book when he's talking about color theory and the way Paul Klee works with his art. He describes Paul Klee as somebody who understands color that's not at the surface of things, but shoots up from the roots of the world. And I think he sees language as doing the same kind of movement and springing forth from origin. So yeah, let me jump to Carrie, I think. Hey, Carrie.
Hello. Yeah, I just I'm not that far into it yet. I'm still dragging myself through the first chapter. It's not the sort of thing I usually read. But thinking about language, it really reminds me of how Philip K. Dick sees language in terms of if this is coming from the future, which of course for Philip K. Dick it also is, it might be coming from something that uses language in a way that knows about these similarities. So if there's an informational thing that we are drawing this from, then the origin of it in the past might not be as important as a knowing of it from another perspective. And also that reminds me of Burroughs. So I just thought I'd briefly throw that in there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Carrie. There's some really fun, as we've talked about a little bit before, there's some fun overlaps with the way Philip K. Dick is talking about this, the presence of the future and kind of remembering the future, and the way that Gebser seems to be articulating this integral ontology. And I would say, for the major, I mean, obviously, like it's hard. Where do we find the evidence for that? Do we go to quantum physics for that? Do we go to mysticism? Do we go to religious paranormal experience? Like Eric Wargo goes to like time loops, right? And has talked about this. Jeffrey Kripal has talked about this. I think to some capacity, that's absolutely a very interesting avenue to explore. In a very practical sense for Gebser, and not that he would discount this poetic spiritual dimension, but in a very material sense, he was interested in how the future was going to be playing an increasing role in the present. And I think for us living in the conditions of the Anthropocene, there is this sense in which time is is kind of condensing around us, right? That and Gebser was really before the whole ecological movement, and yet a lot of his writing seems very resonant with contemporary writers like Andreas Malm, talking about the presence of the past with fossil fuels, the activity of the present, and how it's kind of going to be playing out in these feedback loops, right? There is, and if you move into this in a more spiritual or poetic sense, there is this kind of new relationship that an integral oriented practitioner might want to explore, right? The presence of our ancestors and the presence of the unborn. There's really interesting practices around this with, let's say, like Joanna Macy's work and the 7 generations exercise, et cetera. So I think it's a very interesting arena to explore, as we were talking about earlier with science fiction as well. Yeah, Luke, and thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in on that, because that's definitely a bit of the focus of my work and relating to Gebser around the mystical and the spiritual. And we actually just kind of have been working with spirit guides and ancestors and connecting to those experiences in what we could call the magic mythic structure of consciousness as how we engage with it. So yeah, it is, for me, what I've been absorbing with Gebser over the last year, since really kind of diving into it and just kind of getting really caught up in it, honestly, and translating an integral Christianity through a more Gebserian sense, at the very least complementing a more Wilberian or approach to things. And yeah, the sense of really embodying those latent structures within us, is some of the work that we're doing and bringing into we space groups and individual practice of, like, saying these latent structures within us are actually embedded, right? Like Gebser connects the mythic structure to the heart. He connects the magic structure to the entrails, I think is the language he uses, right? But kind of the gut, that space of the hara, or he might, we use the term spiritual womb in that sense, to really tune into a knowing from those spaces, a tapping into those consciousness, and then we kind of associate feet with the archaic, the roots, the earth, that sense. And so for me, it's really come a lot more alive through that embodied participation in, like, my first encounter with Gebser was very transmissional and resonant, and there was like a mental grasping and non-grasping, like right, he kind of like confounds and confuses at times. I think if it's only the mental structure that we're able to connect to him with and engage with these concepts and ideas. And so just that process of coming into transparency and seeing that as an embodied spiritual act of awareness in and through these centers that then connect us to these structures of consciousness. Just wanted to bring that up in this space and into the conversation, because I know for me that's been a really helpful and liberating way to engage with it and to bring it forth in ways that if we encounter ancestors or spirit guides mostly from the mental structure of consciousness, so we're going to bring in skepticism, we're going to bring in imagination, right? The imaginal there is one way of engaging with it, that might be a little more mental, and so we're not actually accessing those structures of consciousness with the awareness from those structures so much as kind of viewing those from a different structure. So therefore we're not integrating, we're not coming into those processes of moving toward a transparency and a wholeness that can then sort of bring online the integral structure. So just throwing that out there. It's been a bit since we've chatted, Jerry. Good to see you. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that or reflections. Just wanted to bring that into the space. Yeah,
Luke, thank you. Thank you for bringing that in, because it really is at the center of Gebser's work. As much as we can nerd out about, nonlinear history of consciousness and kind of conceptualize the different structures in this much less linear way for Gebser, he was a contemplative in this sense, and of having these really interesting, I don't even want to just call them experiences, but for Gebser, this was a very sensorial embodiment, right, of these spiritual principles. Well, transparency for Gebser isn't a concept; it's this sense of a direct concretization in his body, right, of the magic and the mythic, etc., through this spiritual present. So he has a kind of spiritual phenomenology kind of implicit in ever-present origin, even though he's not really coming from a particular tradition. We could say he's sort of rooted or stemming from the Western European Christian milieu culture, but he's not necessarily attempting to put that forward too directly, although he does here and there, as we know. But yeah, I think the takeaway for me, just in summation here, in terms of this aspect, is Gebser talks about the need to live each of these structures in a way that they are concretized through our senses, right? So as you mentioned, the magic in the gut, the mythic in the heart, and image making, right? Soul making, as Hillman might call it. For Gebser, that like most of the book is this really interesting urging of the reader that this is not just words, right? That they actually have to revivify these structures in themselves, and that is a very powerful, potentially dangerous thing sometimes, because there are these intensities that are going to be welling up. And part of it is also this kind of like equanimity you need to have, where you really want to like read the structures from the modern sensibility, as you're saying. Like, we really want to say this about the mythical polarity, but he cautions us, don't go there. Don't try to shine a light on the mythic. The night has its own form of meaning. If you shine a light on it with the mental, you're not going to see what's there. So yes, I think there's a profound sense of embodiment, and for Gebser, again, it has to be concrete. It can't be an abstract integration. And what does that mean? To live, to concretize the structures. It has more to do with this kind of practice, experiential. Gebser's word for it, I love it. It's senseful. He calls it senseful awaring of these different dimensions of our being. And it has to be through that, or it's not really integral in the sense of actually embodying integral consciousness. So thank you for, that's right at his heart.
Sure. Mm-hmm. And the concretizing, that was a word I struggled with early on. And what helped unlock that for me a bit was, he talks about the crystallization as well of consciousness, which to me feels helped kind of awaken that sense of, like, again, the transparency, the light. There's a passing through that then reflects almost prismatically, but it only does that if there is like this sort of solidifying element of that reality in your body, in your lived experience, right? Kind of crystallizing in the sense that makes it in a way that the light can pass through and reflect in that in essence. So yeah, cool.
Yeah, and just to speak a moment to like the application of this for Gebser to not only the 20th century, but certainly the 21st century, and what like Vervaeke is describing as the meaning crisis, right? Is for Gebser, we can understand what's going on through the structures in terms of the tendency for the mental structure, and it's sort of deficient, which means a kind of overemphasized or kind of fixated, unhealthy relationship, right? One directional or overemphasized direction of one particular structure, is that it creates this unhealthy relationship with the others. So these conditions of atomization, loss of meaning, the kind of the sense of, like the existentialists describe as being thrown into the world, right? This meaning crisis, this inability to really bring forth wisdom in ourselves, is for Gebser a crisis of this mental structure, which is going through a kind of breakdown. And part of that transparency as something that's palpable and livable is very often, it looks like remediation, right? It looks like, oh, there's these other dimensions of my being that I have not really been paying attention to, and I haven't had the language or culture to really bring in here in terms of practices of wisdom, practices of soul making, right? So these other structures begin to kind of come in as this natural, I would say, well, natural. This is an interesting caveat and kind of mysterious one that's difficult to kind of pin down here, but it's important. And it's the volitional dimension of these structures coming into being. For Gebser, they're both from us in the sense that we are enacting them and bringing them into the world historically, materially, and also in our kind of inner work, however we would describe that. But they're also kind of initiating us. So there's a sort of relationship with us and consciousness here. So the mental isn't just our structure of consciousness or the integral. So in some ways, I guess what I'm saying is transparency is an event that can occur and has occurred in this kind of fundamental ontological sense. Like it has happened to the world, and we're reeling from this sense of the mental not really working anymore. The other structures are really kind of coming in and remixing and playing, and there's concordant, technological phenomena that are sort of parallel to this integral age that's happening. We mentioned McLuhan. So this is an event that is happening to us, but it's also something that we have to kind of bring into ourselves or bring out from ourselves and realize, as you're saying, crystallize. And this is sort of an interesting dynamic there. But I bring this up because, some conversations go into shamanism, indigenous wisdom, and is this a regression? Is what is going on here? And rather than seeing it as any kind of linear sense of going back or forward, it's an integration, right? It's a remediation of particular structures that we have not had a good relationship with for a long time. And it's not the mental that's synthesizing and integrating for Gebser. It's the integral. So yeah, great, Luke. Thank you. Brendan, feel free to jump in. Yeah. Oh, you're muted, by the way.
Thanks. So to that point, and I'm just trying to maybe like force the point or the differentiation here, so I can try to, make sure I'm actually getting this. It would almost seem like from Gebser's view of the integral that Wilber, what Wilber is advocating or articulating is not integral consciousness. Does that make sense? What would you say to that idea?
On a day where I'm grumpier, I would say yeah. Okay. On a day where I'm feeling a bit more even keeled, I would say my take on Wilber's grand synthesis is Wilber is moved by this sense of everything being whole, right? Like in that spiritual sense. And Wilber is using the tools that he has and the tools that our age has to attempt to express and articulate that. I don't think, so I think it's a kind of hybrid of the integral and the mental in that sense, in this sort of Janus faced. And this is something not only Gebser, but a lot of thinkers have had like a way of describing being in this sort of liminal or interim age where, like Gramsci talking about the interregnum of the old and the new wanting to be born. And Gebser has this Janus-faced metaphor where he's saying there's these admixtures of the new consciousness, and then there's old structures of thinking and concepts that are attempting to kind of grasp it and master it. And there's a lot of experimentation in this sort of middle space and a lot of confusion, because it's like, well, let's try to spatialize wholeness and time. Let's create a theory of everything. Let's accommodate time by creating these gradations of consciousness, right? And do this in such a totalizing way to try to like capture it as best as possible. And I think those are well intended, but ultimately not things that we'll be able to do as successfully. So I would say Gebser's a sort of a Janus-faced thinker, more so than Wilber's a Janus-faced thinker, more so than Gebser. Of course, we all are, because we're living in this interim age. But I think Wilber kind of doubles down on some older tools to do the job. But
I mean, there's a radically different sort of way of being in the world and set of tools that you would bring to trying to solve the world's problems if you take either one of these approaches. It seems like they lead to radically different conclusions, right? So like, I'm reading the Atman project right now, and Wilber kind of begins that by saying, hey, I used to advocate the sort of romanticist paradigm, right? That like we need to get back to that undifferentiated thing, right? And now he's like, no, I was wrong about that. That's the path to regression. That's going backwards. That'll lead to the opposite place of where we need to go. And he makes that point a lot in Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, and in other places in his work, is that it's very clear that like, if we head back through the structures of consciousness, we're not going to lead to, greater holism. We're actually losing holism as we do that. And so how you apply these different ways of the integral consciousness then becomes really important. Am I supposed to get in contact with my magical self and my mythical self and live that out kind of contemporaneously in that diaphaneity and that, temporic sort of transparency? Or to Wilbur, that would be in some ways an act of regression in some way, right? So because he's changing view with each rung, he's not integrating views. So I guess I'm just sitting with this, with these different sort of presentations of what it means, what integral consciousness really means, because they do seem to lead to radically different.
Yeah, I agree. Again, when I'm feeling grumpier, I will just straight out say, like, Wilbur's attempting to reify the mental, to really kind of grasp this emergent sense of the evolution of consciousness, et cetera. And by dividing it up that way, there's no way you can be integral about it, even experientially. So like, yeah, I could be hard like that, but I've tried to become more sympathetic, because no one's attempts are really like purely, in the new in that sense. But I will say, I will advocate for Gebser, obviously, because I think Gebser hasn't really been, only recently, I think, have some interesting innovations and discoveries in archaeology and history, just in terms of like the recent David Graeber and Wengrow book about the dawn of everything. But not just them, there's so much other very interesting data. Not only the history of consciousness being much less linear, but also the kind of mutation he's talking about is so fundamental and such a given, right? Like Wilbur starting from such a profound given of like orienting everything in a particular spatial way. That given has to be challenged. And that's what Gebser was challenging and saying, we need a new way to even just perceive phenomena, relate to them. And if time is this diaphanous, transparent thing, time has different shapes. It's not a line. It looks more like a rhizome, or this sort of interrelated, alive. I don't know. It looks like an ecology. I use the example with my students. Time looks like a rhizome. Time looks like a network for Gebser. Or we use the fun concept of the Calabi-Yau manifold, which is this really fun quantum physics image of shifting, folding, and folding, dynamically moving and interrelating with the sense of the whole. So Gebser's saying, like, well, how do we think like that, right? It's kind of a challenge. He's leaving a challenge, I think, back at 1949, 1950, 51, saying, even our concepts, in order to even talk about this, aren't sufficient at the moment. So what we need, and this is where I think his poetic history comes in a very important way, we need a new, he describes it as, we need a new statement. We need a new way to learn how to think with time, and we need new concepts. We need new utterances that help us think differently with time itself. And that is tremendously difficult. And we've seen innovations with it. I think Bruno Latour's recent work with critical zones is a really good illustration of what he means. Latour did this really interesting kind of both critique and then also sort of process oriented art exhibit, where basically he's playing around with the perspectival thinking in the Renaissance, and sort of anthropologizing the Renaissance thinking of like studying a static object, observing it spatially, measuring it, breaking it down. Is, well, no, things don't exist in the world in reality like that. They're entangled. They're more like hyper objects, to use a Tim Morton word. So how do we depict that in our sciences? How do we actually work with that? How do we think about the sense of the whole and the planetary in this much more entangled multidimensionality? How does this actually work for art, right? So this is a mutation of perception in the same way that the Renaissance artists were. That's what Gebser's pointing to. And so while he may have not laid it all out for us in the ever-present origin, I think he kind of broke that open, and it hasn't really been answered yet, in my opinion. Although, again, like I'm saying, Wilbur was quite he's quite brilliant. And I when you're reading Wilbur, you're really swept up with how everything is logically fitting together. But I think this one little crack is one of the most important things, and it's not addressed in Wilbur's work.
How late is this going till?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Guys,
I was going to ask something, but
No, please do.
We
I think
often-
in
Yeah,
the past
please.
we've
We're doing
done
like
an hour and a
90
half.
minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So a half an hour or so. Yeah, Jill, please.
cool. Hi everyone. So I'm coming at this whole conversation from a real different angle. I've read a lot of complementary stuff that I feel like is saying similar things, and maybe I'm not sure how I'm going to kind of bridge the gap here, and I don't want to spend a lot of time. I'm going to take a shot. I'll take a shot and see if I can bridge the gap. So I brought up in various threads on the Metamodern group the book by Judea Pearl, which I thought was really concise and made this really nice distinction between kind of these levels of causality, which I don't really like that word. I would get rid of the word causality, but if you kind of fuzz that part out, I kind of think of it more like levels of cognition, and I kind of think of it like a way of doing mental operations that kind of remove context in general. And there might be ways you guys talk about this. But I've been kind of interested in what, rather than asking the question, how do we kind of fortify what we feel like is missing? The reverse question, which is how do we stop doing what's getting in the way? And I personally have found that way more tractable and actually answerable, which I don't want to go into too much, but I'm just kind of curious. I mean, I'm happy to, but I feel like that would take the whole deal there. And I'm kind of curious, if the stuff you guys have been talking about, reading about within the integral world, if that's a thing of kind of doing the reverse image on the problem.
I will say that, thank you, Jill. That's a really good framing. I think for Gebser, there is, he tries not to be systematic in his articulation of the new structure and how it might be showing up in the world. But then he does have some structure in place, and he does have a kind of process that he hints at. And one of the things he repeatedly brings up throughout his writing is a good precursor to, I don't know, living the new, embodying integral consciousness, figuring out the new utterances and statements, etc. Rather than starting there, a good place to begin is more of along the lines what Luke was saying, in practicing to become flexible again, to not overemphasize the mental structure. I mean, in some ways, this is part of Gebser's argument. We have overemphasized a particular structure, the mental structure associated with modernity and et cetera. It has its own sense of time, its own sense of relationship and directivity and thinking. And what would really help remediate that would be to stop overemphasizing that. So in some ways, yeah, let's practice and explore how we are not just the mental. And that means developing some flexibility and exploring the magic structure of consciousness, and exploring the mythic and the archaic, and exploring it in our body, right? And exploring it in various practices, being aware of how we kind of fluidly move between different forms of time in our day-to-day life. And it's that kind of awareness, I guess I'm aware kind of moire pattern, M-O-I-R-E, like there's the sense of folding and unfolding, stretching and then kind of coming back to the mental, but stretching out of the mental, right? That dynamism as a practice begins to create a sense of the interrelationship of all of these different forms of being that co-constitute us. And so for Gebser, that's sort of an indirect way of beginning to arrive at this integrality or transparency. It's simply releasing our fixation on the mental, cultivating a sense of flexibility, moving between the different structures as best we can. And it's almost like the sense of the whole begins to coalesce through that. You know, it's happening between the practices, that sense of transparency or wholeness. The fluidity of the structures begins to kind of take shape as a feeling, as a sort of participatory knowing. And I think this is probably the most helpful thing we can do. And very often, like those practices are, and they do look like going to undergoing a sort of realization that there's other ways of looking at reality, right, and experiencing time, and these other structures that are alive in us and quite profound in their own way. And that sense of shock and recognition and valuing and leaning in, that's where the practice can really kind of begin to shine, right? That's where integrality can really begin to sort of appear through us, right? Kind of crystallize in us through that kind of. I will just mention in that understanding, there is a trickiness here that I think Gebser would probably align with Wilbur about, and Wilbur makes a lot of comments about the pre-trans fallacy and not regressing, and Gebser makes a nuanced similar point in that when we are practicing with these structures, when we are attempting to concretize them and embody them in our lives, to allow for a sense of equanimity with them, to really be present for them as they are in their own way, while not overemphasizing them, because there's going to be a desire to do that because they haven't been integrated. We're hungry for soul making and wisdom, right? It's so missing in our contemporary lives. So there might be a propensity to overcompensate. And so Gebser's always warning against that. It's not really about completely diving into one structure or the other. That's not the point. So that's the tricky part. But I would say, yeah, de-emphasizing the mental and de-fixing us is the starting practice.
Okay, so I have a question. I don't know how the word mental is being used, but I would, I'm curious to get an answer on that. But are we being mental right now? Is this an example of being mental?
Yeah, I would say so. But it's also, we're listening to each other. So there's a kind of auditory dimension. But mental for Gebser is really the kind of modern sense of self that we have, self-reflexive, kind of abstracted, in our heads a lot, a directive sense of time, living by the modern pace of life and the modern schedule with clock time, right? There's I don't think a lot of us are aware of or consciously working with, let's say, like the extended cognition of like place-based thinking and the non-human world, let's say, in like the magical. So yes, I would say predominantly our locus is in the mental, but it doesn't mean, as you were saying a little bit earlier in our talk today, that the other structures aren't co-present. As like we're saying, like auditory is definitely here. So yes, but also with caveats.
Yeah, this is I think where it all seems to matter a lot to kind of figure out where these lines are, because now I'm curious, is the imaginal and mental, or is it, you know what I mean? Like if you're doing simulation, future thinking, would that fall under mental? Maybe, I guess I probably need to just read up on what is meant by mental in this context.
Are you familiar with Ken Wilber's work at all through Gebser, or because we're using the terminology of the structures, and the mental structure is a specific structure of consciousness Gebser used? Yeah,
I'm familiar with a mental center from Gurdjieff work, and I don't know how much those kind of overlap.
I see.
But yeah, and I've worked at that framework a lot, and I'm kind of onto a different way of breaking it down, kind of a disembodied. I'd consider something decontextualized mental, and everything else. If you look at Gurdjieff's idea of integrating these things, my current stance is kind of that when you return to the imaginal, there's a sensory component to all of cognition. There's a cognitive component to all of sensation. Like that, you can't separate the three. So you're kind of returning back to that knowingness. And then the question is, what creates the severing? And the severingness is not, to me, as complicated as the unifying. So it's like, and the doing is a little bit simpler because there's not an attainment if you're undoing. So anyway, I kind of like that model in general, kind of going after an undoing versus a doing, in order to allow things to emerge that would start to reveal a more holistic knowing. But again, like I keep getting tripped up on the mental thing, because then there's also, of course, this really simple distinction that there's lots of, great abstractions around of selfing, basically, when you like Thomas Metzinger's concept of when you need to construct the abstraction of self, like under threat or pain or something, and the rest of the time you can kind of let that expand out. And so when you're under this kind of threat or, reacting from that place, you start to model things a lot differently. And so things get harder and things, I would say that's kind of feels mental, that move. So yeah, how does that resonate with how you're using it?
Sort of similar. For Gebser, it's a bit more of a closer to the way Wilbur uses a particular like stage. Like Wilbur has that mental stage. It's sort of like that, but again, it is not as sequential. But I would say though, one of the words you mentioned, like sort of dissociation, right? Or did you use that word for the mental?
Yeah, decontextualize.
Decontextualize, yeah.
Cleaner, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's very, very mental. Decontextualization, generally speaking, the mental structure when it comes online in the history of consciousness for Gebser's map or story, the mental is very decontextualized from, let's say, a more magical animistic cosmos, where cognition is far more embodied and relational, and you kind of cognize with the non-human world, in their sense of place, etc. So that there is much less of that in the mental, for sure. There's more self-reflexivity, egoic sense of consciousness, etc. So similar, but you're right. It's very difficult to trace who's using what in what particular field. If you're not, are you familiar with Cynthia Bourgeault's work at all?
No.
I really recommend, I'll post the link in the chat, but Cynthia Bourgeault is kind of coming from integral Christianity and Gurdjieff, and recently last year discovered Gebser and has some really interesting syntheses with Gebser that you might appreciate and kind of find as a bridge into some of Gebser's framings. So
cool. In terms of the solvedness, I can't say it. Sorry, my blood sugar's low and I've been working too many hours and not sleeping enough. How solved is this problem? In a parallel thread, since we're on Gurdjieff, I do think that it might be, what he was actually doing to solve this problem is a bit of a mystery, but I've been talking with some sleuths and have some ideas that there might have been a doingness to it and a solvedness to it. But I agree that it's still a mystery, of how to kind of make this stuff start happening more proactively. But I think that it's a really interesting distinction of like, there's simply the kind of the erasing of the decontextualizing as an action. And then what also I hear people pointing at and have, and especially in metamodern with the word spirituality, is a bringing in of the act of bringing in something instead, as opposed to letting something emerge. And I'm really curious about that, that interplay. I feel like that's what you're pointing at. Some of what you're pointing at is that which is which. How do you, how do you know what's going to emerge versus what you would have to, I don't know what else you're doing other than letting it emerge, really, but
yeah, no, those are some good points and distinctions there. I'll point to the way Gebser's articulating the structures is on the one hand, they're doing us, right? Regardless of how we end up internalizing them, realizing them in ourselves and in our culture. They're kind of, they're in that sense like fundamental tectonic, grounds of our being, right? That they're the ground and atmosphere in which we are just living in, and we can culturally and individually realize them. But there is a sense that volition is only half the story. Like our choice to enter that is also the choice of that mystery to enter us in that kind of more contemplative sense of consciousness engaging the human and the human responding creatively to realize these dimensions or structures of consciousness. So there's a participatory element in Gebser's work that's very, very, very strong. But yeah, thank you, Jill.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really cool.
Brandon.
Well, I've already asked questions already. Maybe I should allow for other people my comment was a little bit on the how this connects into some analytic philosophy and some insights that I had from doing software development and how the semantics behind some of these different temporics. There might be something to explore there, but actually, I've already asked questions. It's not really much of a question. I was just going to make a comment on that, but since I've already gone before, and we only have about 10 minutes left, maybe other people will give more of an opportunity for everyone else to go here. At least one person who maybe hasn't gone yet.
Yeah, that'd be great if anyone wants to jump in with either a question or a comment or a clarification. I know we've been kind of hopping all around Gebser today, so yeah, feel free to take this in any direction.
Or if nobody's going to say anything, then I'll just comment here. All right, so with temporics, we have the linear time, we have the circular time, we have the time that is timeless. Maybe there's other kinds of times where, like, just in one part of the world or one subculture, they might be a little ahead of other parts. So the future is already there, right? That's one of the things, like how these collide with each other, and then maybe that's the aperspectival is like you can already see the future unfolding and happening, This is something I've seen, doing software development. And that I think would give some insights into the bridge to analytic philosophy, where, sometimes, even though a lot of analytic philosophers, they kind of, they don't really like continental, or they're a little condescending or dismissive, but there sometimes are people who provide that bridge, and they're saying, okay, no, there are semantics here. There's a deep meaning to this. And I think that's, to some analytic philosophers, they'll hear about these temporics and they'll say, well, that's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. But then if you provide this, explanatory, semantics, that's one way to approach this. So some of my work, I kind of straddle the divide between analytic and continental, and I probably do neither very good, but that's just that's the approach I'm taking. I don't know if you can comment on that.
I think I'm probably the least informed on analytical philosophy, though. So I can't really comment too much on that. I would imagine that analytical philosophy would probably be very skeptical about the future having some kind of agentic or creative force on the present. But yeah, I think Gebser, and I don't mean to sidestep exactly, but I associate the perspectival more, and maybe you can help build that bridge, as you're saying. There's a bridge here to be built with analytical philosophy. But maybe, well, for me anyway, that Gebser's thinking is more looking at, well, it's not exactly about logic and causality anymore. If things are acausal and sort of arising in synchrony, there's a different kind of causality that's showing up if the future can influence the past. And if it's not all predetermined, as a kind of like chain of causation that repeats into eternity, right? It's just one big static thing where everything's predetermined one way or the other. In Gebser's thinking, it's kind of a cosmological thinking, right? That there is freedom and creativity in the present, even though the future can influence the past and has some shaping force, but it's shaped in a way that we participate in the shaping. So again, there's this weird, you get the image of this sort of flux and fluidity, kind of an interactivity, where agency is really important and freedom is really important, as much as things are all happening at once. It's difficult to get your head around, for sure. And again, I go more with, like, I don't know, like McLuhan talking about the logic and causality is sort of the structure of thinking of the print age. And then with electronic culture, everything's happening at once. So causality becomes constellations of things affecting one another in resonance or synchrony. And so in some ways it almost sounds magical. And so that's a question I brought up with my students. What if the integral is kind of seeing time as this whole interrelated whole? Where does causality show up in that? And then how's that different from the magical? And I haven't really been finding good answers quite yet.
Well,
Can
I
I
can.
chime
I
in
actually
something?
have.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that there is I think, a way to rescue this.
Yeah.
With depending on how you define the terms, it just seems like a certain interpretation of this is entirely compatible with analytic philosophy. But I'll just leave it at that.
I'm interested, Brandon, in hearing more. We'll definitely unpack that. I'm very curious. But Jill, did you want to?
Oh, I
bring in
wanted
a point,
to
yeah.
say, I want to just like understated but completely overlooked point that I bring up constantly in all these kind of groups I participate in, which is that we really do live in a particle, it's a particle wave duality, and not just quantum mechanics, it's like at the root, but the particle's the hack, the wave is the fundamental. But if you look at a lot of how we even use language, the causality, I think, comes out of the serialization. We have to serialize everything. It's just like what we do. Even if you wanted to kind of describe the net or the collage or the constellation, you got to kind of flatten that structure, which anyone's tried to write a book probably knows how maddening that is. Just flattening and flattening these webs. And so whenever I get stuck in my thinking, also I have a background in physics. That's my background, is all hard sciences, and then the graduate work in atmospheric science, and 25 years as a paraglider pilot. So I switched to turbulence as kind of my metaphor and fluids about everything. And I tend to get a lot of intuition about like, well, how would I describe causality in a fluid? What really happens in fluid dynamics, that like literal fluids. And that often rescues me from these kind of what wrong with causality. And I see that like across analytic philosophy, it's even some books I've recommended, Judea Pearl, I say I don't like these as causality. There's kind of this fixation on a kind of Newtonian, particle based, and you almost kind of sniff out if someone believes fundamentally that's what it's about, and if you can get them to do the move to kind of admit maybe it's all waves and there's nothing there, maybe it's all negative spaces, there are no actual objects, it's all the no thingness, is a better model of reality. Like I feel like if you can sniff that out, then you have a willing participant in kind of thinking along with you. And if you can't sniff that out, it's going to be pretty painful in my experience.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. That's a good that's helpful for me. I kind of take the ecological thinking when you imagine causality in a complex living system that's open-ended and processual, and there's many different factors that are kind of co-causing a particular thing, and many different agencies. You end up getting the kind of complexity that. Well, maybe the quantum physics term also helps, but it does also, for me, ecological thinking and thinking about complex systems and ecology is also a very helpful way to begin thinking in this sort of a-perspectival turn that Gebser was attempting to describe, where logic is not so Newtonian, right? There's interagencies that are kind of all playing a part in the shaping of a particular thing coming into being or going out of being or dissipating. So I would say, that's more of the model. I mean, it sounds like what you're talking about is similar in that sense, but for me, ecology is helpful. Like, what is the logic of the a-perspectival? It looks like a complex living system. It looks like I was saying, I use this for my students, metaphors of what if time was a rhizome? Like what if the shape of time looked like a mycelial network? How would causality work there? What would it mean for something to kind of happen through time if time's actual structure was like this? And just sort of playful, creative exercise to begin imagining time in a different shape. And that seems to help too. I think a lot of this has to do with getting our social imagination to begin thinking about time differently and getting out of that sort of Newtonian model, which is so pre-given, even in some of our circles. So, anyone else? Brendan, maybe any thoughts, or anyone else who wants to jump in?
I've got lots of thoughts. If you're talking about me, maybe we're kind of running low on time. So, I mean, I'm not sure if we could really go too far into some area. I mean, maybe just one thing that comes up for me, and I think this would take some unpacking, is The perspective that Gebser seems to be articulating, one, I guess this book originally came out in 49. The version I have is a second revised edition, and it's published in 66. And so he's writing this at sort of kind of pre-postmodernism and everything that would kind of come from that. And I've heard people raise this before, like, to what degree is Gebser kind of describing a certain postmodern perspective rather than maybe something that we would think of as integral or metamodern or what have you? And obviously, all these terms are, just kind of heuristics anyway. But I guess for me, I'm still trying to find the both the efficacy in using Gebser's work by sort of setting it apart from Wilbur's work, trying to find bridges between them, or also trying to figure out where they don't bridge. I'm intrigued by, again, kind of the different directions that these tend to go in. I'm intrigued by how there's sort of an integral community, but what might be meant by that word could be radically different. And so I'm intrigued by how that maps onto how people talk about God, like if you kind of talk in a mythic God versus a, rational God, et cetera. And so there's sort of a lot of ambivalence and a lot of kind of ambiguity there that I'm intrigued by. But so anyway, all that stuff is kind of coming up for me, and I'm interested in. But I guess just to kind of home in on that original point, like I just wonder, especially given the kind of artistic examples that Gebser's using, what you would make of the idea that a lot of what Gebser is talking about is stuff that gets explored in postmodernism, and even actually kind of, modernist art itself. I mean, he uses Picasso so much as an example for what he's getting at. And if that's sort of quintessentially, an integral conscious structure as he's viewing it, then like that seems to afford or map pretty well onto like a kind of high modernism. So again, I don't even know how interesting those questions are, but that's all the stuff that's floating around in my head. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think that one's pretty straightforward, and it is an interesting topic for me because it's something that Wilbur has kind of framed Gebser as somebody who is really talking about the relativistic postmodern turn and wasn't really talking about integrality enough because he lived before that time.
I'd love to know. I'd love to read that because I've only seen him basically reference Gebser as basically being like, yeah, he's talking about the same thing I'm talking about, but it's like, well, wait, no, not really. So
it's in the I'll share it with you. I think it's in the endnotes of SES. Okay. A lengthy endnote about what Gebser meant by the aperspectival and how that was really talking about this postmodern turn. And in a kind of like, patting him on the back, like the guy wasn't around for this stuff. And so, I don't think, it's understandable that Wilbur would have that as a sort of framing for Gebser. But again, if we're talking about time as far less of a sequential thing, right? And that means, there can be eruptions of something really interesting and prescient, and then we recede from that and we stop exploring that for a while and we double back on other things, And I think when we look at the 20th century, particularly artistic movements, we might even be able to say that, or other things came to the fore with, let's say, like, Frederick Jameson talking about postmodernism and pastiche, right? There's a deconstructive element, there's a surface oriented, structuring or valuing of things and remixing, et cetera. So there's like an electronic culture element with that. So you could say the aperspectival kind of showed up with all those things, right? Electronic culture, et cetera. But it maybe wasn't as explored explicitly after the modernists. And there's other dimensions that were being articulated. So I just don't see it as neatly fitting. I would say that Gebser was reading into the modernists certain, and this is something one of my mentors and a colleague, hopefully colleague if I get my PhD, but Debashish Banerjee mentioned to me in conversation about Gebser, and it was his reading too. He's an art historian as well, in terms of thinking about this, but he was saying, the modernists were really exploring something kind of interesting. They were playing with time. They were doing something with the avant-garde that was that kind of got lost in the series of traumas and crises of the 20th century. Like post-war, we were doing things different before then. So we can kind of see a sort of nonlinear movement here of very interesting experimentation, playing with time and transparency through modernism, and then that receding into other aspects and other values. So I would say that is my short-handed description of what Gebser was doing there. I would also say, just as, like you, like all of us, we grew up in these postmodern, metamodern times. Like, what does Gebser's A Perspectival have to do? I think broadly, because Gebser was talking about these really deep-seated mutations, right? These deep-seated structures that are almost like environments or tectonic plates that take a long, there's a long sense of how profound a shift they are when we move into another structure over the course of history. Since Gebser's using the structures that way and not as stages, we can still talk about different periods. Okay, the postmodern turn, right? The metamodern turn, and the structures still apply in terms of this Janus-faced perspectival tension. They're almost like these underlying deep grooves that are articulating all these kind of minutiae, in particular decades and intellectual turns, etc. But those are, I'm not saying they're not deep, they're just more contemporaneous. They're more of like the eddies and the swirls and the particular micro-historical movements of thinking. And Gebser speaking to something a bit deeper and difficult to just shift over. Like, you can't add the postmodern after the mental. Right? Like, I think that was a sort of categorical misapplication for Wilber to take out Gebser's what Wilber typically does in his books is trade out Gebser's mental term and stick in the rational, and then add in the pluralistic, and then add in the integral. I know what Wilber's doing, but I think it's a bit too sequential, and he's using these things in a different categorical sense. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that was clear or not, but.
No, it's yeah. And we could keep going with this. I mean, I have lots of questions about stage theory and all that stuff. So I don't know. Maybe we can do another version.
We can unpack that, yeah. Another time.
Well, we can schedule number 2 on this. I don't know when you guys might be available for that. It could be every 2 weeks. Now, this particular one, I said I couldn't do it yesterday because I was had a building meeting. In the past, we've done on Wednesdays, or we could keep going with Thursdays. But if you'd like, we could try to schedule the next one now with whoever would like to participate.
Well, yeah, we can. If you want, you can throw things in the chat, or we could try to figure that part, hammer this out. I've got to run myself, so you're welcome to figure that out. Or as I say, we can try to figure it out in the group. But I will just say, at least on behalf of myself, and well, hey, why not? It's always funny when people say on behalf of me and everyone else. It's like, hey, I never consented to that. But thank you, Jeremy, so much for this. Your expertise and your knowledge of Gebser is deeply helpful, really. I mean, to navigate a text like this. So again, I think that we can pick this up because there's more to be said for sure. But thanks anyway, and thanks Brandon for facilitating this and getting the Zoom link out there and doing all that. And thanks everyone for joining. But I myself have to peace out. But I'll let everyone else peace out on their own terms.
All right,
all right.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. And
thank you.
If you'd like the recording for your own whatever, your own YouTube channel, or I can upload it to mine.
Either way, whatever you guys normally do in terms of the uploading process, that should be fine. Just
upload it to mine, but I just wasn't sure if you, for some reason, wanted to upload it to yours.
Appreciate it. I'll link everyone over to your page so they see what's going on here. But thanks again. This was really fun, and let's definitely get the next one on the calendar clock mental times sometime soon. And we'll talk again soon.
Okay, awesome.
All right. Bye.
All right.